So I'm going to talk about this book, Buddhist Magic, and I'm going to not exactly say what's in the book, but take you on a bit of a journey to show how I came to write this book, how I came across that particular book of spells in Tibetan from Dunhuang that kind of sparked my interest in this subject and led to me reading much more widely around the literature in magic in different traditions. But again, always coming back to this particular one book of spells that started this journey. So as I wrote in my the very beginning of the book, I quoted this this passage from Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, a great novel by Susanna Clarke, where she said there are books about magic and books of magic, and that the former books about magic may be had for 2 or 3 guineas at a good bookseller, such as Watkins, and that the value of the latter is beyond rubies. And in the book, I clarify that this is definitely a book about magic, not a book of magic, but it is a book about a book of magic. So I'm not writing to sort of train people to be magicians or magic users. I'm not saying that you can use this book to do things like bring rain or break up 2 lovers or the various things that the spells that I've translated say you can do. But I am studying these spells and letting you kind of study them and compare them to other magical traditions in the world and understand more about the history of magic, our kind of shared human history of magic. So that's my kind of proviso, and or to say it in fewer words, don't try this at home. So the journey that I promised starts on the Silk Road, which is a kind of popular name for these trade routes you can see here, traveling from China in the east through to, in ancient times, the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and Europe. And along these trade routes, all sorts of things were traded: jade, silk, paper, and also knowledge. So the things that were excavated from the Silk Road are especially multicultural and come in huge numbers of languages: Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, lost languages like Khotanese and Tocharian, and they mix together all kinds of religions too: Buddhism, Christianity, Manichaeism, and all sorts of things. So it's a fascinating area for studying the history of human culture. Now, if you have a look, I don't know whether my pointer can be seen, but if you look at where the Silk Road first splits, traveling from the east, where it sort of leaves China, kind of central China, and goes into the Lop Nor Desert and the Taklamakan Desert, there's an area called Dunhuang, which is really on a crossroads on the Silk Road. And in Dunhuang, there is a famous site of Buddhist cliff-built caves, temples cut into the cliffs and decorated beautifully as Buddhist shrines and altars. An amazing site, which is now one of China's major tourist destinations. For my the reason why I'm talking about it here is that, well, here you can see a particular set of caves cut into the cliff face. The one at the bottom is numbered cave 16. In the kind of official numbering of the caves, there are several hundreds. And you can see in cave 16 there's also entrance to cave 17. And there's an aerial, kind of rather plan view showing the entrance to cave 16 and this little cave 17 coming off it. So what was cave 17? So this is it now, and you can actually see how it was originally designed. It was a memorial cave to a Buddhist monk, the abbot of Dunhuang, who died in the middle of the 9th century. And his statue was consecrated and put in this cave. and at the same time, some of his belongings, including his manuscripts. And over time, more and more paintings, Buddhist manuscripts, and other holy objects were placed in the cave until it became almost completely full. And then it seems to have been sealed up at some time after the end of the 10th century, so 11th or 12th century. And that way it remained for many centuries. Until in 1900, the monk on the left, who was renovating the caves, discovered this little niche that had been sealed away and broke through that door and discovered this huge cache of ancient manuscripts and other Buddhist material. Now, this was the time of the so-called Great Game, where the colonial powers of the world were exploring the Silk Road. The French, British, Germans, Russians, and the Japanese all sent expeditions to the Silk Road in search of ancient artifacts. And here you see one of these people, the French explorer Paul Pelliot, inside that cave, consulting manuscripts. So what happened was these explorers negotiated with the Abbot Wang here and took away to the British Museum, to the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, to the National Library in Berlin, all over the world, the contents of this cave. So they became eventually scattered across the world. Their scholarly value and their kind of immense importance to the history of Buddhism and of the region and of the Silk Road and China and Tibet was quickly noticed. So they became very kind of highly respected sources for scholars. But because they were scattered across the world, it was very difficult to kind of get a complete picture of what the kind of context of these manuscripts were and what the practices of the people who put them in the cave were. There's also actually, I should say, a big collection in the National Library of China. And so for me, I've worked at the British Library since, well, a good 20 years now. And we've got a project there called the International Dunhuang Project, which was an initiative to bring together all of those institutions to cooperate and to photograph and digitize these manuscripts and put them online on a free website for everybody to consult together. So a lot of my work in the last 20 years has been doing that, as well as studying the manuscripts. So here, the main, I suppose, the slightly largest group of manuscripts from the cave are in Chinese, and then just behind those we have Tibetan manuscripts like these ones shown here, photographs taken by Aurel Stein, the Hungarian British explorer who took these manuscripts to the British Museum and then now the British Library, where they're located. So in my work studying and cataloguing these manuscripts, I came across this particular one, which is the one I'm going to talk about today and the one that sparked my Buddhist Magic book. So it's a little booklet. You can see it folded in the picture on the left and then opened up with its binding on the picture on the right, and it's written in a cursive Tibetan script. On the cover, the name of its owner is written in bigger script. And this dates from, as I said, that cave was probably closed in the 11th or 12th century. This book probably dates from the 10th century, so the sort of, around 950s maybe. Now, when I was working on this text, I also had a blog called Early Tibet, where I used to write about interesting manuscripts that I came across. And this one I wrote about in 2009, a Tibetan Book of Spells. And as you can see, I started with the question of whether monks can do magic, whether Buddhist monks can and should practice magic. And this post on my blog became the most kind of debated, the most got the most hits, the most responses, and I realized there was a lot of interest and also a lot of I think puzzlement about the the role of magic in Buddhism, because as you probably know, the main kind of thrust of Buddhism is towards enlightenment, towards some non-attachment, um, towards freeing oneself and all living beings from suffering. And the practices of magic, as we'll see in a minute, don't exactly match with that lofty aim always. So this is, again, from the same blog where I just listed some of the spells that are found in this book. So they're all fairly short, and this is actually just a sequence from one particular part of the spellbook, and it really gives you an idea of the range of what we find in there. So yes, if you want prophecies to bring demons under your power, to pacify malignant people or wild animals, to cause a spring to burst forth, to find objects or treasures, to cure illness, to cut off curses, to reverse the flow of water, and then make it flow the right way again, to cure madness, dog bites, to divide lovers, to reconcile friends who have parted, and so on. So I think this really gives you a sense of the kinds of things that you find in Buddhist magical texts. A real range, but at the same time, there's a really strong kind of theme to this, I think, which is really about the day-to-day needs of ordinary people. So, looking at the Book of Spells itself, this is what it looks like when you open it up. It's got little holes, as you can see there, string holes, and it's probably because this is actually a kind of recycled paper, so it comes from the loose leaf poti format of paper, which is uses these holes as string binding. So the string would be threaded through and bind all the loose pages together. But this is a stitched booklet, so they're not needed. So it seems to be sort of recycled paper. And you can also see there's the writing is quite cursive, you could say, and there's also little notes in between. And it very much seems like not a kind of fancy book, but something that was put together for use, really. So whoever wrote this wrote it to use as a kind of personal book of spells. So I'll now give you a few examples of the way the spells work in here. So the first one is for a kind of exorcism, and this is really characteristic of a lot of the sort of medical spells in the text, because a lot of illnesses and other afflictions were thought to come from various kinds of demons. So in this case, the spell is what you do is to burn the skull of a cat, then mix clean earth in with that kind of burnt, presumably crushed skull, and make mold the form of a cat. And then this is the where you can see it's a Buddhist practice, in the presence of an image of the thousand-armed and thousand-faced one. It's a form of Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion. Take a sword that is made from wrought iron, and saying the mantra, chop up the figure of the cat into 108 pieces. Then by saying this mantra, the illness caused by that demon is swiftly cured. So that's one spell, one little ritual for a particular purpose of expelling a ghost or a tiger-headed demon. There are also more than one spells for invisibility. And here there are two, and you can see, again, the very kind of specific nature of what you have to do to cast these spells. So, very specific, the first one. On the 8th day of the first month of summer, catch a frog that is going eastwards and bind its feet with a string. Leave it in a dark place to dry out, and in the middle of the day of the full moon, in the appropriate month, in a vessel made of gold, silver, or jewels, break it up and then remake it again with dung. After that, bind it with string and dry it out. After doing this 3 times, it should be thoroughly dried and carefully tied up. And then presumably it's can be used to make a little ointment. Apply little dots all over your body or anoint the eyes. You will become invisible. The second one is slightly more simple. Defeather the head of a crow and fill it with seeds, then grow them in dark soil. And standing in front of it, pour in the milk of a dun cow and rainwater. Once the fruits have ripened, cut the flowers and fruits and tie them carefully. Mash them with the milk of a dun cow and anoint your eyes. You will become invisible. So 2 invisibility spells. Now we also find, and here is something that again is rather surprising in the Buddhist context, perhaps, which is aggressive magic, which well, under which category I mean both kind of violent magic and one magic to kind of control people's emotions in a way. So the first one, and I should say this is the only actual kind of really violent spell in a book which contains hundreds, but it's I think important to know it's there. So if you want somebody struck by a lightning or a meteor, you make a particular mudra, you recite the mantra, and then you use the mudra to indicate where you want the meteor or lightning to strike. So and that's the sort of the most, I suppose, sort of aggressive spell in the Book of Spells. The second one is to break up two lovers, which means putting their names on paper and trampling them under your feet. And if they still don't separate, you say the mantra 200 times and visualize them breaking up. And after a day or so, they will no longer be lovers. And then the next one is the opposite of that. It's to reconcile people who have become unfriendly. You do the same, but you visualize them being reconciled, and they'll want to reconcile their quarrel. So I categorize that under aggressive magic because it's kind of controlling people's emotions. Now, much more kind of characteristic in a way, really, of Buddhist magic is there's a lot of it about protection and care of all kinds of people, and this is one for pregnancy and childbirth, beginning with somebody who wants to have a child, and this one involves making a mandala on the ground, and then which is sprinkled with flowers, and the outer part is delimited with 5-colored thread, and then you perform a puja in the mandala, which is the woman dressed in new clothes and having washed, comes into the middle of the mandala, ornamented with jewelry, mustard seeds placed on her head, and she stays until midnight reciting aspirational prayers and confession. She recites the mantra from a Buddhist text called The Great Destroyer of the Universe, holding the 5-colored thread and tying a knot for each recitation and then untying it again. And once that's done 108 times, the monk who's officiating this writes the mantra and the name of Kinara, the captain of the ogres, on paper and attaches it to her. So this is a kind of protective practice that is used both to help women to have children and to protect those who are pregnant, so that the fetus flourishes. So one of the things I also talk about in the book is there's all kinds of material or materia magica used in these spells, and I translated them from the Tibetan, but this is just to show you various things that are used: agar wood, animal bile, beer and birch bark, cumin, camphor, cherry, cloves, cotton, dung, and excrement. In fact, there is one eye medicine that involves using dung and a garlic plant, google, which is a kind of incense, and indigo. So that's just a few of the kind of materials that are used, and it's really fascinating topic, really, to see the kind of, again, cultural differences here and similarities with magical and medical practice in other traditions. Now I want to show one more spell. I think this is the last one, because it's also really fascinating to see how this seems to be a spell that was found really across from Europe to Tibet and China. And you can see whether you think it's it's the same spell, but there's so much similarities across these different traditions. So basically, it's a divination using a mirror or another reflective surface, which could be even oil on one's thumbnail, but also a sword, a kind of polished side of a sword. And so the selection of this is just a part of the spell, actually, but what you do is rub the ointment on your thumb while reciting a mantra. Then the really characteristic thing in this practice is that the person doing it doesn't look in the mirror themselves, but a child, a prepubescent child who is, I think, felt to be more kind of receptive to visions, will look in the mirror and will see the visions, and then will report what they see, and those reports of visions will be interpreted by the person doing the divination. So they can look into a mirror or a sword or that thumbnail with the reflective oil. And it all takes place in a kind of Buddhist mandala again. So it says, as it says here, you cleanse yourself and you make offerings and you fumigate the area with the Google incense, reciting the mantra. And the child is also cleansed and blessed. He looks towards the eastern opening and the mirror is placed there. And then what you've thought about in terms of the question that is being asked will appear within the mirror. And as the practice goes on to say, then the child is asked about what they saw there. So this is fascinating because there are so many examples of this same practice being done in Jewish magic, in Egyptian magic, in Ethiopian, in a German grimoire, and also this really interesting account from John of Salisbury from the 12th century, not so much later than the Tibetan Book of Spells. So this is a description of what John of Salisbury wrote by Richard Kieckeffer, I think. So he says the idea was to anoint boys' fingernails with some sacred chrism so that images would appear reflected in the nails and would impart information. Alternatively, a polished basin might be used. After certain preliminary magical practices and the requisite anointing, the priest uttered names, and this is quoting from John of Salisbury, who was a child then, which by the horror they inspired seemed to me, child though I was, to belong to demons. The other pupil declared that he saw certain misty figures, but John himself saw nothing of the sort, and thus was ruled unqualified for this art. But it is very similar, isn't it? It's a reflective surface, even so far as using a nail. The child being directed to look and then questioned about what they saw. So very interesting. And I think it really shows how magical practices can be transmitted across different cultures and languages, and because I think they really address these basic needs that we have. So the one similar tradition of magic that's relatively well known is the Greek magical papyri, which were found in Egypt and are in both Greek and Demotic, I think. And this is just one text, and as I say in the book, one kind of representative list of spells from that particular text in the Greek magical papyri. And I think you can see here the similarity of concerns. So restraining anger and getting friends, producing a vision, driving out demons, love spells for attraction, consecrations, restraining people, questioning corpses I did not find in the Tibetan Book of Spells, business spells, and again love spells. And there's more in the whole corpus of the Greek magical papyri, and so many similarities, and just even if not in the specifics of the spells, in that just general sort of human day-to-day needs that they address that are so similar in books of spells in different traditions. So in the book for Buddhist Magic, I came up with a sort of threefold definition of what I meant, because of course magic is a difficult word to use because people have used it in human history in so many different ways, and we have people like James Fraser and people who've had very specific ideas of magic, of sympathetic magic and things like that, and I felt none of those really quite are right for Buddhist magic. So my three, you can see here, they're things that are performed for this worldly ends. That's not for kind of otherworldly ends, not for enlightenment, but really just for those needs, human needs of here and now. They're characterized by a swift, clear relationship between the ritual and the result. So they almost always say, and you'll have seen this in some of the examples, within a couple of days you'll see the person will get better, or the lovers will break up, or something like that. So unlike a lot of religious practices in Buddhism as well, where you might pray to the Buddha or Bodhisattva, or you might make offerings, but you don't really expect to know that you will get a result in 1 or 2 days. These particular magic spells are different in that they do say when you should expect to get the result. And finally, presented in miscellaneous books of spells. So that's to say, where we find these things is in things like this manuscript that I've been studying, books of spells where you get dozens or even hundreds of different spells. So just quickly, I also talk in the book about where this fits in the Buddhism in general. So I've been talking about this particular place on the Silk Road and this Tibetan text, but what does this really mean for Buddhism as a tradition generally? So I looked at this book, which is very interesting and useful, by Kenneth Zisk, about the role of healing in India, and he's particularly looks at Buddhism and Buddhist monks. And this quote here is kind of sort of central to his argument. So, as he says, in the beginning, medicine was part of an ascetically based religious movement, a portion of which became known as Buddhism. And then medicine evolved along with the Sangha, that's the Buddhist community, and monasteries in India, and became codified as part of Buddhist scriptures. So medicine then went into the Buddhist scriptural tradition as well, the sutras. It gave rise to monk healers and provided the basis for subsequent development of Buddhist monastic hospices and infirmaries. So what he also looks at is in the monasteries, there are actually kind of places for people to come and be healed. And finally became part of the standard curriculum in Buddhist monastic universities. So that's like Nalanda and those great universities in ancient India. Then when Buddhism began to spread to other parts of Asia, medical institutions and practices of the monastery went along as integral parts of the religious system. So it's really to say that you can't really separate even Buddhism from healing. And what I say in the book is also you can't really separate medicine from magic, because as you'll have seen in some of the examples I showed you, medicine curing is often to do with expelling demons. Even if you're sort of creating a cure through an ointment or a potion, it'll be done with a mantra. So you can't quite kind of separate ever medicine and magic in Buddhism. And in most pre-modern traditions, actually, it's true. Insofar as how far back this goes, the earliest surviving Buddhist manuscripts that have been called the Buddhist Dead Sea Scrolls are the Gandhari manuscripts found in Afghanistan, written in the Kharoshthi script, and dating from the oldest, I think, probably the 1st century BCE, running to about the 3rd century CE. So this one's probably from about the middle of this, around the 1st century CE, and it contains a protective mantra. And the quote here is about, so the monk who uses it, that he doesn't have to be afraid of human beings or non-human beings, wild beasts, snakes, demons, yakshas, which is kind of a monster ogre type creature, or of evil-minded people. He can't die from a weapon, he can't be burnt by fire, and he cannot die in the water or from poison. So this is a kind of protective text, which could either be carried as an amulet or the mantra could be recited for protection. And this is from a very kind of early phase of Buddhism. So certainly before Tantric Buddhism, before even the Mahayana, probably, we have these spells. So they go back to very early in Buddhism. And this is, as I said, actually one of the very earliest surviving Buddhist manuscripts which contains a spell. And then just to also, I'll just very briefly say here what I go into a bit more length in the book. We also find magic across the Buddhist traditions, across Asia. So Tibet first, so this is a printed book still in use in Tibetan Buddhism, but it's a book of spells that was written by Bari Rinchen Druk in the end of the 11th or early 12th century. And as you can see here, it shows various magical diagrams to be used for various purposes. And we also find similar things in Theravada cultures. So sometimes people may think that, of course, you would find these kind of magical practices in Tibet, which has Tantric Buddhism and all kinds of weird things, all those kind of wrathful deities and things like that. So you would expect it in Tibet. But part of my own journey in writing this book was to discover how absolutely fundamental magical practices also are in Theravada countries like Burma, Thailand, and Southeast Asia in general. And that's goes back a long way, but is also very present now. So this is a manuscript showing a yantra or a magical diagram. But you can also go to Thailand and get one of these as a tattoo, or you can buy a shirt to wear with one of these as a protective garment. So it's really part of that culture as well. In a form of Buddhism that's often presented as much more kind of austere and much more about the kind of core principles of Buddhism, of non-attachment and meditation and so on. But so as I talk about in the book, the discovery for me at least was how much this is as much a part in those cultures as it is in a place like Tibet. So just to show you another website, in the last couple of years, still at the British Library, I started working with the Endangered Archives Programme, which is a kind of funding body which gives grants to people to go who found or own manuscripts or other material that's in danger of disappearing, to photograph them and digitize them and preserve them. And at the British Library, we also make copies of these available. And what I discovered coming to this project was, again, that kind of global reach of magical practices. So staying with sort of Buddhism and to some extent Hinduism that's found in Nepal, this is a lovely manuscript with diagrams for rituals. And in this case, particularly rainmaking rituals that are done with the nagas, or the serpent spirits, sometimes called dragons, which is actually how I translated them in the book, because in China, they're shown in different ways, but in China they look like Chinese dragons. As you can see here in Nepal, they look more like snakes in India. But they are the creatures that are in charge of water. So for all rituals that are about bringing rain, stopping rain, or even dealing with the kind of physical ailments that are associated with water, nagas are involved. So this is something that was digitized by Shankar Tapa in Kathmandu Valley, with lots of other texts, lots of magical manuscripts, still in use by the Vajracharya families in Kathmandu Valley. And this is a different project in the sort of Ladakh area, focusing more on the kind of focusing more on the kind of people who do these practices. The anthropologist and photographer Patrick Sutherland carried this out, working with these performers called Buchen, who wanted to preserve their traditions and to kind of record what they did, because I think there's a fear that this won't be passed on to the next generation. And as Patrick wrote here, they're performers of specialist rituals, they're actors, they kind of tell stories about Buddhism, but they're also healers and exorcists. And they consider themselves disciples of the Tibetan saint Tangtong Gyalpo. And yes, as I said, they perform together an elaborate exorcism ritual. But again, this is a really interesting example of, I think once you sort of, in any Buddhist tradition, go to look at what's going on the ground, there's always a great sort of rich strain of magical practice going on there. So that's not quite everything that's in the book, but it's a sort of, as I said, I wanted to take you on a bit of a journey of how I came to write the book, and where I started with that one manuscript from the Silk Road, and where I ended up with the Endangered Archives Programme, looking at magic practice as it happens now in different Buddhist cultures across the world. So thank you. Manuscripts from Dunhuang, and I'll go to this picture. They date from the 9th and 10th century. The earlier ones were done during the period of the Tibetan Empire, when the Tibetan kings ruled over a vast area, including the Silk Road and including Dunhuang itself. And one of the things they actually did was commission hundreds of copies of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra and a Long Life Sutra of the deity Paramitayus. And these were found in the cave. So the one that's at the front here is actually one of those. It's a Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, and that would be from the sort of middle of the 9th century, so probably the 840s, say. And then the Book of Spells itself, with that kind of more cursive, informal handwriting, this is probably from about 100 years later. So we're talking about the 950s or so. So yes, this is a little earlier than the period of Milarepa, but it's certainly not far off. And it's also, if you're talking about early Bumpo manuscripts, also kind of definitely a similarity there, because these are such early examples of Tibetan writing. And I do talk about that a bit in the book. So I do distinguish in the book between supernatural things that come out of magical practices and the siddhis that come out of as kind of side effects of meditation. But there is, in the Tibetan tradition at least, a similar distinction between the what are called kind of ordinary siddhis and the ultimate siddhis. So ordinary ones being the things that come out of those practices that allow you to create wealth or pacify enemies or something like that, and the ultimate siddhi, which is the achievement of enlightenment itself. So I think this, which I mentioned in the book, is kind of considered in the Tibetan tradition itself, because Tibet really was the country that absorbed the late Indian Buddhism, including magical practices, and they really had to think about how these things sat alongside each other. So yeah, I would say the Tibetan distinction between ordinary siddhis and ultimate siddhis is sort of the best way of conceiving of these different kinds of accomplishment from Buddhist practices. Yes, there are. I mean, I think it's important to realize how hard it is to distinguish those things, when I think often, in India at least, people who were experts in spells and in magic didn't necessarily themselves really consider themselves Buddhist or Hindu. So in a way, there may have been a whole kind of class of spell users who were neither specifically Buddhist or Hindu. But I would also say that some of the books of spells, like the one that I showed from Tibet, from the master Barry Lotsowa, some of them actually invoke Shiva and Ganesh at the beginning, and really then give a kind of clear indication that they came from teachers more on the sort of Hindu side of things than on the Buddhist side. So yeah, I think there is certainly influences from outside Buddhism coming into the Buddhist magical tradition. I mean, it's certainly worth remembering with Ra Lotsowa, who you were mentioning, that he was very controversial in Tibet as well. But I mean, certainly that idea of causing death as liberation is something that's very. I think if you talk to Tibetan lamas, it's something they would be very cautious about, because really the idea is you almost have to be an enlightened being yourself to be able to see that doing this would bring somebody a better rebirth in the next life. So I think in saying that you're doing these magic spells in order to help people to, so they die and get to a better rebirth, really you're saying you can see what they would be reborn as in the future. And that's really almost a quality of a Buddha. So there's a sort of in that Tibetan tradition an aspect of, yes, you can do this, but really there are so few people at that kind of advanced state that you can't. So I think that was a lot of the debate around Ra Lotsoa and his use of these kind of violent spells. But that said, I gave a talk about this a couple of years ago, specifically about this violent and spells and killing in Buddhism. And there's another story about a Buddhist master who went to Bodh Gaya, a Tibetan master, and he was being debated. He was actually first he went to Kathmandu, where he was debating a Hindu scholar, and he lost. And then he went to Bodh Gaya to find a practice to defeat the scholar, but he found this magical practice, and he did it kind of so strongly that the scholar back in Kathmandu died. And then the master who Bodh Gaya, who had given him that practice, berated him and said, "You weren't meant to do that, and you now need to do a year of penance to make up for it." So there's certainly this kind of feeling in Tibetan Buddhism when you look at stories like that, and in that biography, that wonderful translation of Ra Lotsoa, that this kind of violent practice is problematic and needs to be treated very cautiously. I mean, another sort of part of this journey for me was to, as I mentioned, to go back in time to the very earliest stages of Buddhism, and there, in those early manuscripts from Afghanistan, but also in the temple architecture in India, you see these yakshas, these beings that are both kind of threatening and can also, through the spell, be brought on as your kind of protector. It goes right back as far as we can know in Buddhism. So I think it really is part of the very earliest phase of Buddhism. Really, the sense of, I think, being a monk in the wilderness, being threatened. How do I, feeling kind of insecure and vulnerable? What do I do about this? Well, these violent beings like the yakshas or the rakshasas and so on, we have these spells to bring them on our side, and often I think, as in the Christian tradition, where you might sort of summon a demon to defeat the demons, you subdue one of the yakshas, and he becomes a protector of the Buddha and the Buddhist community. I touched on it in the book, and I'm actually writing something at the moment to go into that in a bit more detail. And I'll actually just show you another book which is sitting on my shelf here, by Sarah Shaw, all on translations from the Pali canon, from the Digha Nikaya. And one of the texts in there is the Atanatiya Sutta, which is where the Buddha is standing on the Vulture's Peak, and the kings of the 10 directions, he summons them to him, and they come and stand in front of him, behind him, and on either side. And they tell him about the dangers caused by creatures like the yakshas and other things in their realms. And he proclaims a spell and subdues those creatures. And then with the spell, the 4 kings go back to their realms, which are now kind of peaceful. And the 4 kings then guarantee that whoever followers of the Buddha comes into these realms now will be safe. And they have this spell as well to subdue beings. And Sarah Shaw talks about this as a mandala, because you have the Buddha at the center, and you have the kings of the 4 directions, and outside you have the threatening world, which is then kind of brought in and subdued, and becomes as I said, those yakshas become the protectors as well. So some of what we see in Tantra Buddhism, in the Vajrayana, is there even in the Pali canon. And then a bit later on, you get things like mantras coming in, and dharanis, which are long mantras, the use of mudras, And as we saw in the Book of Spells, things with like the ritual for the pregnant woman, a mandala being laid out on the ground, and then the woman going to the center to receive the blessing. So what I think you then see in Tantric Buddhism, in Vajrayana, is a lot of these ritual technologies being adapted to another purpose, to a higher purpose in a way. So the mandalas and the mantras and the mudras are now used for the purpose of attaining enlightenment swiftly and in this life. So really, there's that sort of power inherent in the magical ritual technologies is turned to the cause, the ultimate cause of Buddhism, of enlightenment. So that's the first way that magic influences Tantric Buddhism. The second way is plenty of those magical practices just get adopted wholesale into the Tantras. So most Tantras are a mixture of practices for enlightenment, for that ultimate siddhi, as well as practices for the lesser siddhis, such as subduing, enriching, and so on. So those are sort of, I mean, they come in between. If you look at something like, as I mentioned, the Atanatiya Sutra in the Pali Canon, it does have a spell, but that spell is also a sort of is word. It's not a mantra, so it's a kind of like almost a hymn that's spoken by the Buddha. What happens over time is the spells become more spell-like. So there are syllables in there that don't really make any sense. They're like abracadabra, and you get these specific texts which are built around those spells, like the great peacock, or the great amulet, or the one with the rather threatening name that I mentioned earlier, the great destroyer of the universe. Now, an interesting thing about those is, well, first of all, yes, they are panaceas. So a bit different from the Book of Spells, which says, if you want this, if you want to be invisible, if you want to cure a headache, then do this spell. What these ones do is present this spell, and then they say, this is good for protection, for illness, for pregnancy, and so on. So they almost are panaceas. And what's especially interesting is these texts change over time. So scholars have traced this, and they, particularly in China, because things in Buddhist texts in China got translated several times. So the same text could be translated in the 4th century, in the 6th century, in the 8th century, in the 10th century. And then you can really see how it changes over time. And one of the fascinating things about those texts is those names of spells, like the Great Amulet or the Great Destroyer of the Universe, turn into deities. So actually, where first of all you have a text which is taught by the Buddha, and he teaches a spell, and that spell is called the Great Peacock. Over time, the Great Peacock becomes a deity itself with its own practices, and those are kind of now more fully sort of tantric texts, really. So yeah, those texts are something like a thread that links the earliest Buddhism right through to Tantric Buddhism. Yes, there are actually some pictures of those in some of the Khotanese manuscripts from the Silk Road, and they do look rather threatening. They sort of look like human beings with animal heads, but in these pictures they're often holding babies, because those animal-headed creatures were often associated with the death and illness of children. So they are depicted holding babies, and then they're also become, and this is a real theme that I keep saying, that the threat is transformed into the protector. So they also become protectors of children through the use of the magical spell. But yes, I mean, I did in the book provide a kind of bestiary, partly because I decided to use Western names for these creatures. So demon, dragon, ghost, ghoul, imp, ogre, and spirit, which is only as close as I could get it, because it's not quite the same. Obviously, we're dealing with different traditions, with different ideas of what these non-human supernatural creatures are. But some of them are clearly sort of more corporeal than others, and therefore you can call some ghosts and others at the other extreme ogres. And I think it's not too far from how they're understood in that culture. But I also just wanted to give I kind of also did it to give a sense of continuity of our own ideas of ghosts and various kind of threatening creatures that are found throughout our own mythologies. Well, yes, I mean, it's definitely true that there is a association between, so spicy things like mustard seeds are for stronger spells, and I mean, yeah, sulfur again, the strongest spells. There's something called tiger meat, which is actually a herb, which I think must have also been quite a spicy herb. My favourite, really, because it was quite, it comes up a lot. It's the incense, which I mentioned, called Google, because I like its name. Sometimes it's an Indian word, sometimes called Gugulu or Gugula, and its kind of European name is Indian Bdellium. So yes, because I like the name and because it is used in so many rituals, it's Google incense that is my favourite. And the answer is I didn't. And it's partly because not all of them, but some of them come in a particular context of a deity like the Prakriti, where you're meant to do their practices. And as somebody who's kind of been, to some extent, practicing in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, I'm very aware that one doesn't do a practice unless you have the sort of link with a tradition and with a lama and with the transmission and so on. So I feel the same for these spells. It would be disrespectful to try them out, but I also think they might not work because I wouldn't have had the proper teaching context to know how to do them properly. But I did find Google Incense is still sold. With colleagues at the British Library is more on the side of death and rituals around death in Buddhism. So one interesting thing about the Book of Spells is there is nothing to do with death and funerals. So it's all about this life. There's a sense that there's quite a clear distinction there between the person who maybe does the spells for this kind of thing and the person who deals with death and dying and that side of things. But there's a huge amount of literature from the Dunhuang cave about that other side of things. So I'm looking into that at the moment.
Good evening. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you.